Think it's time we rise up, people. It's time's up, people. You can talk all you want, but it won't change a thing. I wanna know what you do.
And I found it completely discouraging to find a bunch of corporate CEOs getting in the middle of politics. My advice to the corporate CEOs of America is to stay out of politics.
Everywhere we could put this on the ballot, it passes by super majorities every time. So, conservatives agree that there's too much money in politics, and also that corporations have too much power. Big corporations have too much power. Citizens United was a nonprofit, it still exists, is a nonprofit corporation. And so if you carve out an exemption for nonprofits, then every Koch brothers nonprofit, and they have dozens, is then allowed to contribute money. And actually everyday people get it because it's common sense. Corporations are not people. Yes, they are made up of people, but corporations also have limited liability. I don't have limited liability out in the world. I'm responsible for what I do personally. So the people behind corporations are not personally responsible for what their corporation does. So why would they have the same constitutional rights because of the individuals? You can't have it both ways.
Right.
And now we're living in a world of the unintended consequences of corporations having so much power. And it's not a very good world by any kind of objective measure of like happiness or well-being.
I'm not talking about political contributions. Most of them contribute to both sides. They have political action committees. That's fine. It's legal. It's appropriate. I support that. I'm talking about taking a position on a highly incendiary issue like this and punishing a community or a state because you don't like a particular law they passed. I just think it's stupid.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Up and Up. I'm Jodi Newell, and I am very excited today to bring on a guest who is actually a friend of mine, a friend in the movement to get money out of politics. Her name is Kaitlin Sopoci-Belknap. And Kaitlin, why don't you introduce yourself? Thank you for coming on.
Hi, Jodi. Thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor to be on your show, and I really appreciate all the work that you've been doing for years in this area. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about it. Let's see. I live in Sacramento, California. I grew up in New Mexico, though, and I moved to Amend's national director. I've been working with Move to Amend since we were founded. I'm one of our co-founders. And before that, I worked with an organization called Democracy Unlimited of Humboldt County in far Northern California. So I've been doing work against corporate personhood and the various ways that that plays out in our society for over almost 20 years, actually.
Damn. Busy lady. So tell me, obviously people who watch this show generally know that I'm affiliated with Wolfpack, and so they hear a lot about it. Anyway, but Move to Amend is another organization that's working in a different way essentially towards the same goal. Can you kind of explain to everybody, what is your theory of change? What is your pathway?
Yeah, sure. So Move to Amend was formed kind of in preparation for the Citizens United decision. And it was originally a coalition of all the organizations that had been working against corporate constitutional rights, or the idea that corporations can use the Constitution to assert rights, generally to overturn laws passed to protect the public welfare. And we expected the Citizens United decision to go as it did, expanding corporate constitutional rights, and then also, money in politics. And then it did happen. So we formed Move to Amend, we launched, and we're calling for an amendment to the Constitution that makes clear that only human beings have constitutional protections, and also that money is not speech and not protected by the First Amendment, so that government can regulate campaign spending. So our strategy has mostly been actually to build a mass movement, because that's the only thing that's going to be possible to force this kind of change. Right. In terms of how we have moved the amendment forward, it has been introduced in Congress in the House 5 times now. Just this month was reintroduced in the 117th Congress. And then we also have passed a number of ballot initiatives and local resolutions through city councils and state legislatures across the country ever since we launched. So over 700 resolutions in different ways calling on Congress to pass this amendment. And we've partnered with Wolfpack sometimes in states, because we're not our take is that, you know, there's 2 ways to amend the Constitution. There's through Congress, which is the way that the Constitution has been amended heretofore so far. And then there's also the ability of states to call for a constitutional convention. And we think both strategies have merit. So we have worked with Wolfpack in a number of states, you know, to push forward resolutions calling for a convention too.
Awesome. So where does that stand right now? Like as far as resolutions, I mean, I don't know if you know off the top of your head, and I certainly didn't ask you for these in advance, but what are kind of the stats? I'm curious, like how many, do you know how many city level resolutions or things like that have been passed so far?
Well, I don't know. I don't remember the exact number, but 700 something,
Hmm.
you know, have passed resolutions through city councils and, you know, county commissions. And then also that includes the number that have been passed by ballot initiative where citizens directly voted. So we've passed a number of those in states that allow for the initiative process, which is not every state. And then there are 4 states that have passed ballot initiatives at the state level: Washington, California, Montana, and Colorado as well. So and then there are more resolutions than that. I think it's like 800, another 100 or so that don't include corporate constitutional rights, but just talk about money and politics. But that's kind of the thing that, because there, you know, as you've probably talked about on the show, and you know, you well know, there are a number of other organizations that have been working against money and politics. But from Move to Amend's perspective, the issue that's actually kind of more fundamental is this idea that corporations can assert constitutional rights, which plays out in more than just campaign finance. It plays out in environmental regulations being overturned. It plays out in worker protections being overturned. It plays out in labeling laws not being able to be passed because corporations can claim First Amendment right not to speak and therefore not have to label what's in their products. And Fourth Amendment protections. So we don't necessarily know what they're doing or what is in their products, what kinds of toxins they're introducing into our food supply or our personal products, you know, like cosmetics and things. So there's a lot more than just money and politics that all goes back to this idea that corporations have constitutional rights, which obviously corporations are not mentioned in the Constitution at all. That these powers have been given to corporations through the Supreme Court and the court, you know, system in the United States, sometimes lesser courts too. But fundamentally, it goes back to the Supreme Court, which is why an amendment is necessary to make clear that, you know, only people have constitutional rights. Any powers that corporations have should come through the legislative process and be democratically decided.
Absolutely. And I think it's really powerful to know, especially I think I think Move to Amend and Wolfpack are fairly similar in this way that it's not really a corporate structure. It's like, it's very grassroots. And so it's volunteers that are in states that are, you know, especially when you talk about city level resolutions, right? Because you have to have people who are in that jurisdiction. They need to be within that state to actually matter in that state, or I'm sorry, in that city or, you know, within that thing. And so you do have to have a certain amount of volunteer power in that to say that, you know, that the people want that. And I think that that is the most beautiful expression of what is actually people power. Who are actually people, you know, in this context, when you have people rising up from the ground up. That's the power of the people.
Yeah, absolutely. And Move to Amend has been, I mean, we do have a small staff team, but we're not headquartered in Washington, D.C. We live all over the country, actually, and our board is made up of folks from all over the country. And our background is all all grassroots organizers, and we really fundamentally believe that the way change happens is at the local level through people building power and capacity and consciousness raising. And so while, yes, our amendment has been introduced in Congress and we do, have congressional relationships, our real power and focus is on the public at large and in organizing people to plug in and get involved and understand how we've gotten into the situation that we're in, where,
Right.
arguably this country is not a democracy and never really has been one. And we're even further away from that than we were, say, certainly before Citizens United. But, over the course of my lifetime, the public, regular people have less and less power and authority over the decisions that affect our lives. And increasingly, those decisions are in the hands of not even, our federal government, but really corporations are making these policy decisions, and then they're handing the legislation over to our lawmakers to pass, or going into the courts whenever we are able to organize and pass laws to curb their excess or rein them in, and getting those laws overturned. And so that makes, our meaningful authority over our communities off the table. And that's why we work on the We the People Amendment. And so kind of no matter what issue you might be interested in out there and working on, it probably has a tie back to corporate power. And we probably would be more effective and more powerful at getting the kind of change that your listeners are working on if we had an amendment like the We the People Amendment.
Absolutely. So tell me about the We the People Amendment. I mean, so this was just introduced again for the 5th time now. Is it consecutively like every year for the last 5 years, or is it spread out over the last?
Well, it's every 2, because every new Congress, it needs to be reintroduced. So it was originally introduced in the 113th Congress. Each year, every 2 years when there's a new Congress, we have to get it reintroduced. We started with a different lead. Now Pramila Jayapal from Washington State is our lead. Originally it was Richard Nolan from Minnesota, but he retired. And so Jayapal took it up, and we have to, recruit back all of the co-sponsors. So we ended last Congress with 75 co-sponsors, which was our goal for the year. In the past, we've always been able to exceed our goal, but with COVID, it was really, we definitely were set back in terms of how to actually reach these folks when we couldn't do in-person meetings anymore. We couldn't do a lot of the actions that we were used to being able to organize. So we still did reach our goal, but we weren't able to get any more than that. So we ended with 75. 68 of those people are still in the House. Some of them, retired or didn't run or ran for other seats or were appointed to cabinet positions. And so it was reintroduced on let's see, what day was that? Monday the 5th. And it's House Joint Resolution 48. We call it the We the People Amendment, but if you're talking to your representative, they'll probably know it better as HJR 48. And it was introduced with 51 co-sponsors, counting Jayapal. So we'd like to get more. We're working to try and get 100 this year. And obviously more is better, because we need this amendment, yesterday.
Right.
But it is, it's an uphill road to get these folks on board. So, that's a lot of what we're focusing on right now this spring. And then hopefully we can get to that number and then go back to doing some of our movement building and education work. Yeah. And less focus on Congress, which frankly is my least favorite part of the job.
I can see why. No, let me ask you, right? I'm just curious because, of course, we've just been having this conversation. So what happened in Georgia with the restriction with the voting laws, and we don't need to get into all that, but no bueno. And then there was kind of this reaction, especially from Mitch McConnell. So this is the one that's kind of being heard, right? Is Mitch McConnell coming in and saying, corporations candidates shouldn't, be involved in politics. They should stay out of politics. And then the next day coming out and saying, except when they're funding us, this kind of thing, which obviously I think most people, with a brain in their head understands that if they're supporting a candidate, if they're putting money into a candidate's campaign, then clearly they do have some influence and in a significant, I would argue, a significant amount of influence for that money. They don't give it for no reason, obviously. But it's kind of interesting. And so when you talk about kind of getting co-sponsors and things like that, I'm curious. I mean, at Wolfpack, we always try to say it's a cross-partisan issue, bipartisan issue, however you want to put it, right? I like cross-partisan because I don't think there are just two. But anyway, but we talk about that on a regular basis, yet it's very difficult to get people who on the right to get involved in it. And, there are some organizations that we try to partner with, that will help out and stuff like that. But as far as, getting the grassroots or getting even people who are in Congress really to support it, it's very difficult. And so my question is just kind of based on what's just been happening in this kind of going back and forth, the Republican Party, I feel like kind of having an identity crisis in some ways. Do you think that that's going to influence, conservative support in, as far as co-sponsors and things like that, or support for it?
Yeah, well, I mean, you've identified the issue. I mean, the crazy thing is like Republican voters, as you've said, and you guys have experienced this at Wolfpack, support this issue. We have gotten a number of ballot initiatives passed in conservative communities at the same time, so when, in 2016, and then 2012, in communities that voted majority for Trump and majority for Romney at the same time, when our initiatives were on the ballot, they still passed, not just by, they didn't just squeak by, they passed by over 75%. And this is the case almost, everywhere we could put this on the ballot, it passes by super majorities every time. So, conservatives agree that there's too much money in politics, and also that corporations have too much power. Big corporations have too much power. There's obviously been a lot of propaganda that doesn't just affect conservatives put out there to kind of conflate what's good for Walmart is good for Main Street, which is absolutely not true. And as people are sort of living the experience of like that not actually adding up, then, they start to become skeptical. Unfortunately, the leadership of the Republican Party, though, is, very on board with Citizens United. And you've got Ted Cruz, who probably will be the front runner for president, or one of them from that party, out there being like the biggest proponent of Citizens United. So it really does create, a real chilling effect, I think, within that party to have the leadership going to bat for large corporations and basically saying, like, we are the party for corrupt business. And so, our amendment right now doesn't have any Republican co-sponsors. In the past, we had one, Walter Jones from North Carolina, who's sort of a different kind of Republican, and he's passed away, and we haven't been able to recruit any others yet. But like I said, we have seen grassroots support. So it kind of has to build from the bottom up. And if there are any Republicans who are out there listening to this show, I would say that like that pressure really needs to come from Republicans on the leadership of their party. And frankly, Democrats are not very many steps behind in terms of, the corporation, the corruption pile or whatever however you want to say that. Right. I mean, that's a lot of the problem too, is a lot of the Democrats that we're not able to get on board, or even some of the ones that we are still taking large amounts of Wall Street money, or and many corporations are giving about the same amount to both parties, because they can afford it. It's a business expense, and they want to make sure no matter who wins and no matter who's in power, they know that they're beholden to the giant, whether it's tech companies or banking companies or military contractors, etc. Those folks are they're not partisan, they're super cross partisan, and they don't care at all. So on one hand, yes, like the Republicans are worse on this in terms of their leadership. But on the other hand, you know, a lot of it is that it's like the whole system is broken and corrupt. And I know that you guys talk that line too. And the biggest issue, I think, is that people don't think that there's anything we can do about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I think it's interesting to think about the way that it's been portrayed by, I mean, and maybe this is a little bit out of date, you know, but I do remember the times when, oh, I'm blanking on his name right now, but I'm pretty sure he's from right over here in Rhode Island. He was talking about unilateral disarmament, you know, that we don't want to disarm, you know, and then just leave it, the other party is going to get all of the money, blah, 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 these kind of things, and we'll never win because they'll have all the money. But this is an amendment which would be not unilateral disarmament. This would be for everyone. You know, this would reduce it for everyone, so everybody would be on the same playing field. And yet it's still not. I mean, so what is? I'm just wondering, right? So as you're talking about this, I'm kind of going back through my memory bank on like, okay, what are kind of the excuses that people give? And I can't imagine, I just don't understand. So here's my question is like, when you've interacted with Democrats, and I guess you don't really need to name names or anything like that, but what are some examples of kind of the feedback that you've gotten from people who are opposed or who don't want to sign on and co-sponsor it? Or is it just nothing? Because we all know sometimes you just don't hear back, right? But
yeah, well, there's certainly a share of that. But you know, some of the concerns are the biggest one falls into the category of like unintended consequences of there will be unintended consequences, and who knows, this might go further than we mean it to, and what if this comes back on us? I mean, certainly there's a number of nonprofit corporations in Washington D.C. that I will not name, but that we would probably consider to be like on our same team as, you know, progressives, but who have, you know, actively worked against our amendment in Congress, and you know, and it comes back to us that, you know, this concern was raised and that concern was raised, and it's partly because they are nonprofit corporations, and yes, this will apply to nonprofit corporations too. It has to, because if you say that it only applies to for-profit corporations, which has been, you know, like Bernie Sanders introduced an amendment that said that some years ago, he never reintroduced it because it's problematic, because it creates a giant loophole. Citizens United was a nonprofit, you know, it still exists, is a nonprofit corporation. And so if you carve out an exemption for nonprofits, then every Koch brothers nonprofit, and they have dozens, you know, is then allowed to contribute money. And actually, that's the main way that they do. Political action committees are nonprofit corporations. So you have to just make it, you know, straightforward and clear, which is why I think that everyday people get it, because it's common sense. Corporations are not people. Yes, they are made up of people, but corporations also have limited liability. I don't have limited liability out in the world. I'm responsible for what I do personally, you know, and corporations are not. The people behind corporations are not personally responsible for what their corporation does. So why would they have the same constitutional rights because of the individuals? You can't have it both ways. And you know, the court ruling this way it's not about logic. And yes, it's true that now at this point we have 135 years of this being, you know, the way that corporations are seen under the law, although that's, you know, expanded over time, but the beginning of it goes back 135 years. So yes, we are talking about rooting out a very, very deep taproot in our legal system that means, you know, a lot of change. And, you know, so frankly, I think that the liberals, the Democrats, you know, and any good faith Republicans that we're talking to that have concerns, that's what they're talking about. But our point to that is, well, look at where we are in the world. We are on the brink of potentially like species extinction. Certainly, you know, thousands and thousands of species will be extinct. We don't know what will happen to humans. We're on the brink of, you know, there's drought and flooding and, you know, massive impact on human life, but also, you know, economic well-being. And that's just climate change, let alone all of the other ways. I mean, look at the healthcare crisis. And, you know, the fact that corporations have so much power is why we don't have Medicare for all and a public healthcare system in this country. And people die in the, tens of thousands every year as a result of that didn't need to. And so the unintended consequences of corporations being given constitutional rights by the Supreme Court in the first place, something they never had authority to do, something that they did by construing the 14th Amendment, which was intended to ensure equal protection for Black people in this country, and twisting that to apply to corporations. And now we're living in a world of the unintended consequences of corporations having so much power. And it's not a very good world by any kind of objective measure of like happiness or well-being. And so that's what we're up against. And the problem is that the paradigm of Capitol Hill isn't really set up to make systemic change. They make tiny little tweaks and they call it a day. And that's not good enough. Our country is letting down the majority of the public at this point. And so, yes, we need to get to these root causes. And one of them is corporate power and the fact that we don't have any legal authority over these institutions that have enormous wealth, so much wealth that they are more wealthy than many, many countries in this world. And so, a big change is the only thing that's going to be possible to shift that. And that's frightening to some people, but, we just try to bring them along and, they want to be seen as visionaries. So we try to remind them of that in different ways.
It's really funny though. I mean, I hear what you're saying. To me, I feel like, a lot of the time it's basically about like what framework you have in your mind. It always reminds me of this George Lakey book, Don't Call It an Elephant. The same kind of, but this frame that you have in your head, in your mind, that says, okay, this is the way that things are done. And then if it doesn't fit into that, it just doesn't compute. It's like, it doesn't make sense in that way. When really what we need to do is we need to change the frame. Like, that's the point. The point is the frame is wrong. The frame has led us to where we're at. I feel like I'm going a little too hard on this analogy, but still.
No, it's absolutely true. And, and I would say that's the most frustrating thing about my job is the fact that one of the things I have learned doing this for 10 years, I mean, we haven't been working with Congress with 10, so say like eight years of that, is that that's just really not the way that they see their role. Right. The idea that we would, I mean, some of them, sure, but then they get filtered into the system or, swept into the system, and that's very frowned upon. And so that's our conundrum. That's our challenge as people who see that we do need systemic change and that the system is the problem, and to not shy away from that. But we also have made a lot, not just Move to Amend. I mean, I look back to, like I said at the beginning, I have been working in this realm for a long time. And, there was definitely also a time where the idea that we would get an amendment even introduced into Congress with 50 co-sponsors was like, absolutely wildly outrageous. But here we are. So I wish that it could go faster. And I think that the changing culture that we have in this country is accelerating in the right direction, frankly. But, Congress is going to be the holdouts, which is why we respect and appreciate, Wolfpack's position of like, these probably aren't the people who are going to lead the charge on, reducing the power and relationship that they have with their donors. Yeah. I mean, they have a very symbiotic relationship with these donors that, finance their ability to be in office. Unfortunately, state legislators are only a little bit less than that, So.
Right. Here, I want to give you a minute, because essentially what we do at the end, I mean, my show is for activists, whatever. And everyone essentially ends with a call to action. So throw it out there. Where can people find out about Move to Amend? What is your, big ask at this point? How can they support?
Yeah, so our website is movetoamend.org, and coming there and signing our petition, which we use when we do have lobby meetings at the federal and state level to say, this many people in your district support this amendment. So that's kind of like the easiest thing to do, and you don't even have to put in any time. Just sign it and share it with as many people as possible, because the more names that we have on those lists, the more powerful we are when we go into these meetings. And then of course, joining with us, we are grassroots based, so we have chapters all all over the country. You can start a Move to Amend group in your community. You can connect with one if there already is one. You can see kind of where they are if you go to the Move to Amend site. The work that we are doing right now, because the amendment was just introduced, is, you know, focusing mostly on Congress and trying to, we have a list of about 135 target offices that we think are the most likely candidates, and that's where we're focusing. So if you go to movetoamend.org/117 for the 117th Congress, 117 campaign, you can see kind of who our targets are. And if your congressperson is a target, you can help us get them on board. And then if your congressperson is not a target, that just means that we've said that they're one to potentially get to a little later, but you could get started right now and we would certainly support you. And then later on this year, you know, kind of after we've done our spring focus on the amendment and hopefully gotten to 100, we will also be doing some of our other, you know, kind of, like I said, education, movement building work. And so there are other ways to plug in if you're not a lobbyist and that doesn't float your boat. There's definitely other ways to get involved.
Awesome. All right. This is very exciting. I can't wait to see what happens with the amendment. I mean, we'll see. 5th time's the charm. And maybe, I don't know.
Well, maybe not this Congress, but maybe 6th time. You know, I mean, we have to get it introduced in the Senate too. So helping us with that. And then, you know, a lot of times these things are like impossible until all of a sudden they're inevitable, right? So that's like the critical mass that we're working to build, and every little piece that we add onto that bonfire helps, you know, get those flames higher. So I don't know exactly when it will happen, but probably not in the 117th Congress, but I would love to, you know, move forward in some big ways. And, you know, at some point we will reach a breaking point, because what is happening right now, where we have, you know, no meaningful say over our elected officials, something's got to give. And so that's part of it, is just making sure that we're there to help make the connections for people about why this is happening. So instead of, you know, immigrants being blamed or, you know, whatever it is, whatever divide and conquer technique the elites are using against us, we can say, no, this is what's happening and this is why, and this is what the solution would be, and be there to do it.
I love it. I love it. All right. Thank you for coming on, and thank you everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, subscribe, and if you have the means, please support us on Patreon. It's Patreon /Real Progressives. Bye y'all. Signing off.